Hello, and welcome to today's Daily Chronicle. Today is Monday, October 6th, 2025. Trump tells Israel to stop bombing Gaza after Hamas agrees to release Israeli hostages. Palestinians watch smoke billowing during Israeli strikes upon arrival on a coastal path northwest of Nuseirat refugee camp as they are displaced southward from Wadi Gaza on Wednesday. Israel's defense minister issued a final warning for Gaza City residents of flee south this week as the Palestinian Hamas movement weighed the latest U.S. plan to end nearly 2 years of war in the Palestinian territory. Israel's military is temporarily dialing down some of its military operations in Gaza in order to allow Hamas to locate 48 hostages, some of whom have died. On Friday, President Trump said that Israel must immediately stop the bombing of Gaza so that Hamas can follow through on its promise to release the remaining Israeli hostages. Following Trump's announcement, Israeli leaders ordered the country's military to reduce its activity in Gaza to a minimum and to carry out defensive actions only, a person briefed by an Israeli official told NPR. Because they are not authorized to discuss the plans publicly. Gaza residents reported continuing shelling overnight and at least 3 airstrikes throughout Saturday morning. Hamas said it would release all Israeli hostages in exchange for the release of hundreds of Palestinian prisoners held by Israel, as set out in Trump's 20-point plan this week to end the war in Gaza. However, because many of the hostages have since died, locating and digging up their remains may take longer than the 72 hours allotted, Hamas officials have warned. In a statement, the Palestinian militant group said the movement announces its agreement to release all Israeli prisoners, both living and dead, according to the exchange formula contained in President Trump's proposal, provided the field's conditions for the exchange are met. It said that other parts of the Trump proposal require further consultations among Palestinians. Trump then calls for Israel to stop bombing campaign in a post on Truth Social. Based on the statement issued by Hamas, I believe they are ready for a lasting peace, Trump wrote. Israel must immediately stop the bombing of Gaza so that we can get the hostages out safely and quickly. Right now, it's far too dangerous to do that. We are already in discussions on details to be worked out. This is not about Gaza alone. This is about long-sought peace in the Middle East. Israel's Prime Minister's office said in a statement that following Hamas's response, Israel is preparing for an immediate implementation of the first stage of the President Trump's plan for the immediate release of all the hostages. The plan unveiled earlier this week called for a ceasefire if Hamas agreed to release all 48 hostages it held following an attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023, with Hamas handing over captives, around 20 of who are believed to still be alive, within 72 hours. In a post to Truth Social on Friday morning, Trump said he was giving Hamas a last chance, or Hamas fighters would be quickly extinguished, he said. They would have until 6 p.m. Eastern Time to reply to the plan, which Israel had already said it agrees to. If this last chance agreement is not reached, all hell, like no one has ever seen before, will break out against Hamas. Trump wrote. The White House released its 20-point plan on Monday as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited Trump. The plan would immediately end Israel's war in Gaza and provide more aid to Gaza in addition to requiring the release of hostages. Earlier this week, Israel ordered an estimated 200,000 remaining Palestinians in Gaza to leave Gaza City and move south. Those who stay, the Defense Ministry said, would be considered a militant or supporter of terror. Despite the pause in military activity, the Israeli military said it would maintain its encirclement of Gaza City in the north and warned residents that attempting to return it poses a significant risk. Gaza's civil defense spokesperson Mahmoud Bazil warned residents in an audio message that returning to areas where the Israeli military had withdrawn from was still extremely dangerous, and said his civil defense teams were awaiting an official ceasefire announcement from the U.S. administration before moving in. Only then can we begin operating under an agreed-upon field plan. Until then, we do not know the exact lines of withdrawal, said Basil. The Army's latest statement indicates it is now relying on a defensive fire, which means shooting anyone who gets close. These are critical hours. We pray this hardship ends soon. The United Nations agency coordinating humanitarian efforts in the region said this week it had received reports of intense strikes in recent days in parts of Deir al-Bahal, one of those places where people have been told to move. Tents, houses, and even crowded markets have been hit, with the UN Human Rights Office reporting that many of those killed appear to be civilians. The UN said the displacement sites in Deir al-Bahal and Khan Yunis are currently hosting more than 500,000 people. On Friday, it called the peace plan a window of opportunity for aid to come back in and for hostages to be released. The mother of Colombian corals. Marine biologist Elvira Alvarado, known as the mother of coral, at 70, she's still diving and pioneering a type of coral IVF to help save endangered species. San Andres, Colombia. Nearly 50 years after she put on a wetsuit, Elvira Alvarado still remembers coming upon a coral reef off Colombia's Caribbean coast. Everything was alive, and it was green and bright orange. And there was fishes. And there were huge things, and they were corals. It was astonishing. She says, "Can you imagine paradise? It's paradise." At 70, Colombian marine biologist Elvira Alvarado is still diving, researching and training a new generation of scientists. Her mission, rescuing Colombia's endangered coral reefs by reproducing coral through in vitro fertilization. Her lifelong dedication to these marine invertebrates has earned her the nickname, the mother of Colombian corals. Coral are vital ecosystems that provide food, shelter, and breeding grounds for some 4,000 fish species. They protect shorelines from erosion. They even support tourism by attracting snorkelers and divers. However, diseases, pollution, and rising ocean temperatures are taking a huge toll. Since the 1970s, more than half of all the coral in the Caribbean have died. I saw them dying. I saw them turning white, says Alvarado, from the Colombian island of San Andres in the Caribbean Sea, where many of the once exotic garden-like coral reefs are now barren. Juliana Vanegas, a marine biologist who works with Alvarado, explains what happens. The coral are still alive, but when they are bleached and are not feeding, they start to get weaker and weaker, she says. And if that lasts for enough time, the coral die, basically of starvation. In addition, coral weakened by disease or overheated water have a much harder time reproducing. So here on San Andres, Alvarado and her team of about a dozen divers, decked out in scuba gear, are lending a hand through in vitro fertilization, or IVF. The technique was pioneered by Australian scientist Peter Harrison. It involves collecting coral eggs and sperm, fertilizing them in a laboratory, then transplanting them into existing reefs. Alvarado has become Colombia's most energetic proponent of the technique. Elvira Alvarado and fellow marine biologists fertilize coral eggs and sperm in the lab, using a pioneering technique to restore damaged reefs. We can't stop what is happening, she says, referring to climate change and highly lethal threats like stony coral tissue, lost disease, which was first reported in 2014 and was spread throughout the Caribbean. But we can try to replace coral that's dying. Alvarado was first drawn to the ocean by television. As a young girl living in the US, she was fascinated by programs like Sea Hunt and Flipper, about a bottlenose dolphin that outsmarts most of the humans on the show. She moved back to Colombia in the 1960s to become one of the country's first female marine biologists to focus on coral reef restoration. Along the way, she got to meet Jacques Cousteau, the world's most famous oceanographer, who visited her university. We sat down and he was talking to me. It was a dream, she says. Elvira Alvarado in the Caribbean Sea, off the Colombian island of San Andres. At 70, the marine biologist is still diving, researching, and training new generation of scientists. Alvarado was a natural underwater. She learned to free dive without air tanks to a depth of 72 feet. She initially did cancer research involving sharks. However, a coral began dying off. She focused on reef restoration by growing new coral. Timing is everything. Coral spawn just once a year, about a week after the full moon. That gives Alvarado's team here on San Andres just a tiny window of opportunity to dive down and collect coral eggs and sperm. Alvarado moves gracefully underwater. Some 30 feet down, she and her team place nets with collection tubes around selected coral. Then after dark, on a second dive, they check the collection tubes. Last night, they came up empty. But tonight's a different story. They've spawned. yells an ecstatic Alvarado, who then rushes off to a makeshift laboratory. There, she and the team mix eggs together and sperm and place them in a water-filled plastic tubes. Under a microscope, they appear creamy white in the shape of raspberries. Soon, the coral hatchlings will be placed in seaside nurseries for 6 to 12 months, then taken back to the reefs. And because the team has gathered genetic material from coral that appear more resistant to heat and stress, their efforts are designed to reproduce harder varieties. The trick, says Alvarado, is to regenerate coral faster than they die, which is also realistic. But coral reefs will not be as diverse as they were when she first started diving in the 1970s. She says we will have reefs that are resistant to the warming conditions. Nets are placed over coral to collect eggs and sperm, part of efforts to fertilize and restore the reef. She's also proud to have mentored scores of young marine biologists, mostly women, who all seem to adore her. She's a very inspiring woman, says Maria Fernanda Maya, who heads the Blue Indigo Foundation that works to restore reefs. She's the mother of coral in Colombia. That's why, when Alvarado finally does hang up her swim fins, her legacy will live on. When I started this, we were just 3 people, 2 students and me. And look what we've got now, Alvarado says. This will continue even after I'm dead. That's the good thing. As U.S. pressure mounts, Venezuela's foreign hostages face growing uncertainty. Liberen a todos los presos políticos. Activists and relatives of prisoners released balloons calling for freedom of political prisoners in Caracas, Venezuela, April 14. Bogota, Colombia. Manuel Alejandro Tique used to live in a peaceful condo on the outskirts of Bogota, from where he would bike to his office in the center of the city several times a week. Now he's in a maximum security prison in Venezuela, where inmates are rarely allowed to communicate with the outside world. We are constantly worried about how he's doing, says his sister, Diana Tique, who lives in the 3-bedroom apartment that has been the family's home for years. She says that during the first months of her brother's detention, she had trouble sleeping, adding that the emotional toll of having him detained without a trial in a foreign prison has been immense. Manuel Tique, a 32-year-old humanitarian worker, is among a growing number of foreign nationals detained by Nicolás Maduro's authoritarian government, as Venezuela faces economic sanctions and political isolation from the United States and Europe. With the U.S. now amassing naval forces and even blowing up several boats in the southern Caribbean in an anti-narcotics mission that Maduro has described as the start of a potential attack on his government. Relatives of the prisoners say they face a new level of uncertainty. I'm scared about the military pressure, says Manuel Tique's father, Victor Manuel. It might lead to freedom, but it could also mean Maduro holds his prisoners for longer. Venezuela's government has accused many of the foreigners in its prisons of plotting to overthrow President Maduro. But human rights groups say these prisoners are mostly tourists. Business people and humanitarian workers who had nothing to do with Venezuelan politics. Juan Papier, the Deputy America's Director of Human Rights Watch, says that currently there are 89 foreign nationals imprisoned in Venezuelan jails from countries that include Colombia, Spain, Argentina, France, and the Czech Republic. Earlier this year, Venezuela released 10 Americans held in its jails in exchange for more than 200 Venezuelan migrants, whom the U.S. had deported to a notorious prison in El Salvador. Papier says that Venezuela intensified detentions of foreigners after its presidential election in 2024, a vote that Maduro has been widely accused of stealing. Dozens of countries do not recognize Maduro's re-election last year, with the current White House officials describing the Venezuelan president as an illegitimate leader who leads a narco-terror cartel. It appears that Venezuelan regime is holding these foreigners as hostages, Papier says. Foreign governments did the right thing by condemning the electoral fraud in 2024. And in response, the Maduro regime is extorting them by holding their nationals in prison and forcing them to engage with the Maduro regime from their release. Manuel Tique was working for a humanitarian group called the Danish Refugee Council, where he traveled to Venezuela last year. He had been asked to deliver a workshop to local aid groups on how to monitor food and medicine distribution. But Tique was arrested at a border post while seeking entry into Venezuela and was not heard from for weeks. In what amounts to a forced disappearance, according to human rights groups. We lost contact with him on September 14th of last year, says his sister Diana Tique, and only got news from him on October 17th, when Venezuelan officials spoke about him on TV. Venezuela's powerful interior minister, Diosdado Cabello, accused Tique of being a mercenary who was in Venezuela to recruit fighters for an anti-government mission. In a year, Tique has only been allowed to make 2 phone calls. He's currently in a prison known as Rodeo 1, where inmates are rarely allowed to leave their cells. Victor Manuel Tique keeps a photo of his son Manuel Alejandro Tique on his phone. Manuel Alejandro from Bogota, Colombia, has been locked up in a Venezuelan prison for the past year. It's heart-wrenching, says his father, because it's a situation that you cannot control. Human rights groups say that it's not clear what the Venezuelan government wants in exchange for Tique or some of the other foreigners in Venezuelan jails. But some say that as Maduro's grip on power comes under pressure, his government is likely to take more prisoners. It's an act of desperation, says David Guillame, a nurse from Florida who spent 4 months in Rodeo 1 and shared a cell with Tique, where the 2 inmates coped with boredom and anxiety by playing chess with pieces they made out of toilet paper. Guillame says he was arrested in September of last year after trying to enter Venezuela as a tourist. He was freed in January, along with 5 other Americans, after a Trump envoy met with Maduro and discussed possible economic sanctions relief. My American privilege is kind of made me chill because I realized I wasn't going to be there for a long time, Guillame says. So I tried to learn the names and nationalities of the people there, to relay the information to foreign governments and American rights groups. But while negotiations to free prisoners have worked in some cases, they can also make things worse, says Laura Dibb, a human rights lawyer at the Washington office of Latin America, WALA, a think tank and advocacy group. It actually creates a very dangerous environment in which anyone can be detained, Dib says, adding that Venezuelan government has realized there are benefits from keeping international hostages. Seeking other ways of pressure without necessarily negotiating and giving an authoritarian government what they want is very, very important, she says. At home in Bogota, Victor Manuel Tique shows a photo of his son, Manuel Alejandro, who has been in a Venezuelan prison for the past 12 months and is detained without trial. Dib points out that several nations are now issuing travel warnings, telling their citizens not to go to Venezuela as a result of a large number of foreigners imprisoned there without trial. Back in Bogota, the Tique family says they want the Colombian government to be more vocal about the release of its citizens and to link trade and security cooperation to their freedom. But with American naval forces gathering off Venezuela's coast, fears are intensifying over what this growing show of force could mean for the prisoners, trapped between fragile diplomacy and the prospect of armed confrontation. What has happened to us is an injustice, says Victor Manuel Tique, and it doesn't help to improve Venezuela's situation.